Thank you very much. Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's Digital Anarchist webinar. We're excited that you're here with us. Our topic is Igniting an Enterprise Technology Transformation, and we have three amazing speakers for you today. Today's webinar is sponsored by Liatrio. My name is Mitch Ash, and I'll serve as your host and moderator. A few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar. We'll send an email with a link to the recording and slides following the webinar. You can also get a copy of it up on digitalanarchist.com. Our speakers love questions, so please use the questions tab to enter any and all questions for them. So let's get on with our topic, Igniting an Enterprise Technology Transformation. I'd like to first introduce Ravi Kaluga, who is Director of Consulting Services at Liatrio. And Ravi will introduce our other speakers. Take it away, Ravi.
Thanks, Mitch. Good morning, everyone. It's my privilege to introduce Ross Clanton and John Willis today. Both Ross and John are advisors to Liatrio, and they're very active in the DevOps community. So most of you on this webinar today probably already know them. Ross Clanton has led transformations at both Target and Verizon and has successfully transformed both of these organizations to being high-performing delivery organizations, and really got our community to get introduced to the concept of dojos, which we're going to get into today, and use dojos as a way for organizations to become continuously learning and improving over a period of time and have a lot of the transformations stick over extended periods of time. John Willis needs no introduction. He's truly an engineer's engineer. He's been with a lot of startups, prominent ones being Docker. He's also authored a lot of books with Devops Handbook, which most of you should be familiar with, and also now Beyond Phoenix Project, which is coming out very soon. So really excited to have both of them join us on the webinar today. Quick spiel about Liatrio. We are a DevOps consulting firm. We get the privilege of working with very large enterprises on their transformation journey and helping them increase their speed and safety of on how they deliver software. We use our expertise by working with these large organizations and kind of share a lot of the information that we gather in forums like this webinar today with white papers and stuff. We feel very strongly about enterprises needing to transform and enterprises needing to transform in a way that is right, not just for their customers, but also for employees who work in these large organizations. Lastly, as Mitch said, we love questions. Our panel can answer questions on a lot of topics. So please feel free to write them up and share on our chat, and we'll get to them. So before we get started, we thought it would be good to talk about DevOps Enterprise Summit that is coming up next week. So both John and Ross are very familiar with the conference. Ross has spoken at the conference a bunch of times. John has been a part of the programming committee. John, let me start with you. Can you talk about your feelings towards DevOps Enterprise Summit? You've been there since day one when it started in 2014. Maybe kick us off with talking about the summit that is coming up and how it ties back to the topic that we have at hand today.
Yeah, I will certainly. But hey, Ravi, I've never been called an engineer's engineer, so hey, that's a bucket list there. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's actually, I don't want to go too long into the history, but Damon Edwards, who's, my DevOps Cafe co-host, partner in crime in this whole DevOps thing, we approached Gene, actually it was Velocity. We were back in like 2012, we were trying to get O'Reilly Velocity to run an enterprise track, and they thought that was ludicrous. Why would anybody want to invite a stodgy old enterprise? And so, over a couple of years of conversation, finally Gene Kim was able to sort of kick off this, sort of grandiose way of like, this is enterprise, and one of the things I thought was really interesting, there was a conversation from about 2011 to maybe 2014 about, does the enterprise have to, this DevOps thing is just for a bunch of kids, greenfield startups, and it was sort of a debate about like, will this DevOps thing actually work for the enterprise? Or a lot of the big five consulting, no disrespect, but hey, I'm sometimes disrespectful to big fives. You would say, oh no, you kids don't really know what you're doing in the enterprise. It's going to have to be done this way. And I remember saying to myself, like, you know what, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And we got that first call for proposal, and we got about 150 proposals at for the first DevOps Enterprise Summit, and about 50 of them or so were vendors. You know, vendors talk about how they do great things in the enterprise, but a good, almost a solid, 100, just south of 100, were enterprises, real enterprises, and they were telling the story about, like, we're not there yet, or, we've tried this many ways, but, like, they were trying, and they weren't compromising. They weren't sort of, bringing in the big fives and saying, well, here, this is how you have to do, bring in 1,000 project managers. And they were really literally, and by the way, I had met Ross before this, but one of the earliest proposals that shined, shined for us, was Ross and Heather Mickman, doing a DevOps story of how they did it at Target. And I had actually seen that presentation when they did it at DevOps Days, and I'm like, yeah, this is the proof that this is going to work in the enterprise. Anyway, yeah, so it'll be the 6th year, I think, if I got my math right, 2019 in Vegas coming up. So, Ross?
Yeah, I love the DevOps Enterprise Summit. It's been probably the biggest thing I've looked forward to every year since it started, and I've had the opportunity to speak there a lot, both from Target for the first 3 or 4 years, and then as part of Verizon the last couple of years. And to me, it goes so far to connect a community of leaders in large enterprises that are trying to drive change. And I completely agree with John. Like, these are people that aren't compromising, and they're really trying to stay true to what DevOps is about, and really drive the right kind of changes inside their companies. And everyone's so helpful there as well. I've some of my best relationships for my career now have all spawned out of this community. John, including John, Gene,
Yeah, I was
and
gonna
many
say,
other folks.
well, the hallway track too, right? I mean, people talk about the hallway tracks at conferences. What I wind up doing is I actually miss a lot of the sessions. I have to watch them later because I just Sherpa people to, like, oh my God,
Yeah.
this guy named Ross Clanton. Because to Ross's point, and Gene says there's no, there's no velvet rope in this conference, including Gene himself. I mean, Gene's just walking the hallway, hey buddy, sit down, and so all these people that you see on stage are just walking around the hallway. And, I wind up people, hey, you wonder if I could talk to Ross, or if I could talk to Jason Cox at Disney. I'm like, come on, follow me. Let's go find them, And I literally wind up just taking these people who are first time attendees and like, just say, hey, talk to Jason Cox. He's an amazing person. And Ross, he can tell you how he's done incredible things at Verizon Target. Yeah, we're sort of selling it, but it is my favorite conference, bar none, of the year. So.
Yeah. So what are you talking about there this year?
I've got this thing I've been doing, 7 Deadly Diseases. It's just sort of, I think we got a slide on it a little bit later, but it's these, I've been going in and just having just conversations at the edge, what I call the people who do the work, the fingers on the keyboard. So I come in at the CIO level, but then I literally just say, here's what I want. And I wind up talking to a couple hundred people in an organization about how they think work gets done. How do they think, what's the disconnect between the executives and them? And it's just been really fulfilling. So I'm going to give a presentation of, like, how that works and some of the interesting stories, nice anecdotes. I've got some really good funny stories. So, yeah. How about you?
Nice. I'm taking a little bit of a different approach this year. Usually I speak on behalf of the company I'm working at, and I talk about the transformation we're going through. Because I'm consulting now and I'm not working for Target, Verizon, or anyone else for that matter, I am going to talk more broadly about product transformation across the industry. One thing we didn't talk about, I know we probably don't have a lot of time on the webinar to dive into it, but we're also both part of the DevOps Enterprise Forum, which is a really amazing event of 40 or 50 kind of thought leaders get pulled together every year. Gene's also involved in pulling this group together to frame kind of guidance for things that are still lacking guidance in the industry. And I know, you and I have both been able to contribute a lot of things as part of the DevOps Enterprise Forum. The the presentation I'm giving this year is actually going to be based on the paper that my team wrote this year. So I don't know if others have done that yet, where they're turning the research papers into a talk, but excited to do that, and I think it'll be a really interesting story.
Yeah, and again, we're going to kill the whole, but this is really cool stuff because people don't know these are once a year. And this actually started, I don't know if you remember, Ross, we did a survey at the first DevOps Enterprise Summit, and then we took the results of that. And then Gene decided to get mostly speakers, but just a reasonably small group, about 40 or 50 people. The first one might have been a little shy, and came to Portland for a couple of days. And it was sort of, we didn't really know what it was going to look like. And it turns out every year we do this now, where we break up into teams of 5 or 6 and we produce these research projects, and they turn into ebooks, and they're all on itrevolution.com. And again, we're not making any money. They're all Creative Commons. They're free. There's now 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, what, six years of these incredible books written by like Ross said, that to me has been one of my greatest networking places, because the people that show up, Gene invites like the right mix of non-ego, incredibly talented people to Portland, and we all just we roll up our sleeves and we work, and Gene's wife says, it's amazing how you get, high paid professionals to do homework assignments for you.
It is amazing, actually. All right, we should probably, on that note, let's transition into our core topic.
Let me.
Yeah, go ahead, Ravi.
No, I was going to say thanks for sharing, both John and Ross. Thanks for sharing that about DevOps Enterprise Summit. It's amazing how many conversations happen there that possibly all tie back to the webinar that we have here, which is around how enterprises need to transform. And one thing I wanted to say was, Ross, I've been hearing your talk since 2015, and you used the slide, I think, at the DevOps Enterprise Summit in 2015, where you spoke about adopt or die, and how enterprises need to either adapt or they're probably not going to survive. Let me bring you back again into the conversation. Do you want to dig into it just a bit in terms of how enterprises in the last 4 years that you've seen, how enterprises are actually adapting, or if they're not, what trends are you seeing?
Yeah, it's interesting. The talk today is really on how do you drive these enterprise transformations at scale. Something that I think John and I both have a lot of insight on, and Liatrio has a lot of focus on it as a consulting company as well. And I'm always, the first transformation I drove at Target, it was a really interesting time where the whole concept of adapt or die was like very front and center for the entire company. Being in retail, 6, 7 years ago, it was pretty obvious that disruption was pretty significant at that point, and Amazon was eating everyone's lunch. No longer was it we're competing, with other brick and mortar retailers, and it's really about Target versus Walmart and how are we going to compete against Walmart. It fundamentally changed, and I think when you have that kind of a clarity inside of an organization that you have to change, it can be really powerful. And it is. I've seen it be extremely powerful in setting the stage for everyone coming to the table and saying, all right, we got to figure this stuff out. And I think the reality is it's happening across every industry right now. And some it's more like in your face than others. Like you can't avoid it. For instance, the retail story. Others, it's a little bit of a slower shift happening. But the reality is, digital disruption is happening. There are new entrants, new business models. People are coming in and competing with existing companies and moving at a speed that these companies have never had to even worry about moving. And that's why everyone's going through these transformations. And so to me, it's always really important to anchor on that why and make sure that, whatever company you're in, whatever industry you're in, you're thinking about that and you're understanding what the disruption is that you have to deal with in your industry, because that's really going to set the groundwork for you to start to drive a larger scale change in the organization.
Yeah, for me, it's funny. Just watching this, I've participated in this sort of DevOps thing in so many ways, right? I mean, I was the only American at the first DevOps day in Ghent, right? I worked for Chef. I'm not trying to give my bio. I'm trying to put perspective. And in early days of Chef, it was that we had discussions with enterprises about sort of infrastructure as code. I mean, we're talking now the 2010, 2011, and they were like sort of touching it, but they didn't know what it was. And it's kind of like 2001: Space Odyssey, that bar like that they find in the beginning of the movie, right? And then you watch that sort of evolve, and to see kind of groundbreakers like Ross and Heather. I mean, there were a couple of enterprises in sort of post perspective. I saw, oh yeah, we were doing this, but what you were doing over there at Target was sort of the first time I had really seen, and my finger was on the pulse, right? I was, I think to this day I've been to more DevOps days than anybody else on the planet, and I was at a lot of places. I saw a lot of stories, and like I was sort of shocked. And I was home. I wasn't at Minneapolis, and you and Heather Mickman were doing this presentation on how you doing DevOps, and I'm like, whoa, Target, let me see this, And to be quite honestly, I had a startup in Minneapolis where Target was thought of as the place, going in 2010, 11, of the place you don't want to go to work for in Minneapolis.
That's right. Yeah.
It was like there was sort of these horror stories of ex-Target employees. Oh no, don't go there. And I'm watching, Ross and Heather like talk about like how they're doing it, and it's not fake. Like it's like, wow, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. Did she say that? And then we get to today, right? And it's funny. I've spent a lot of time in banks over the last sort of 2.5 years, 3 years. So as I go through, just to finish my progression, I go through that. I'm at Chef, and then I wind up doing cloud management, and then I'm at Docker, and meanwhile I'm always involved in DevOps Enterprise Summit and a core organizer at DevOps Days. So I'm watching this all unfold. The last 2 years I'm visiting these banks, and a lot of banks, and it's funny, they kind of fall into three categories. I see it. One, they're just got their head in the sand, right? Which is like die. The other is on the other spectrum. It's like I'm kind of thinking that it's like copy and die. Right, like where they think they're doing sort of DevOps, but they're sort of copying everybody else's sort of version of DevOps. They think they have build run teams, but they're really doing waterfall. I mean, this is stuff I'll go over my presentation. But then there are the ones where you show up, and it's like, again, it's sort of like what I saw with Target and Ross and Heather. Like, oh my goodness, they have this. The formula. They're doing things right. They're building immersive learning opportunities, large banks, and you can just see the separation. You visit a bank on one day, and you see them either in this copy and die or just head in the sand. And then you visit another bank, and you're like, okay, I think I'm going to move my money over to that bank. And it's just so glaring, the separation of the haves and have-nots right now that sort of worries me, or like, sort of warms my heart for the ones that actually are sort of hitting on all cylinders on and it's hard, Ross, like, please, complete me here, right? Because Ross has done this. I always like to say when I'm presenting is that, like, don't take anything I'm saying, like, I'll do this presentation, blah, 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 DevOps is so cool, do this, blah, blah, blah. But then sometimes you forget to say is, folks, I understand this is incredibly hard to do in the enterprise, like ridiculously hard to do in the enterprise. So that's why you have to applaud the ones that are doing it the right way.
Yeah, it's extremely hard. And Ravi, if you don't mind moving forward, I think the reason that it's hard, the reality is everyone is pursuing transformation right now. You cannot, I guarantee you, go talk to 100 different enterprises and they're going to all tell you that they're doing some kind of a technology transformation. And most of them are struggling. Almost all of them are struggling, actually. And the reason is you can't just, it's not a technology change. I mean, yes, there's technology change associated with this, but that's really the easy part, and process change. And, of course, you've got to do those things. But the reality is, to really get this stuff right, you got to like get down to your core and figure out how do you pivot yourself at your core. And that really gets into new ways of thinking and different ways of working, and leadership, engaging differently than they have in the past and leading differently than they have in the past. And I think what's happened is enterprises have built up, 10, 20, 30 plus years of a model to deliver technology for their business that was largely, anchored in waterfall. And when you think about the cultural norms and the leadership behaviors and everything that's reinforced in that model, it's pretty much the opposite of what companies that are doing DevOps really well. It's pretty much the opposite of what they're doing, and that's a really, really hard change. And just I want to jump to the next slide, and then I'll ask John some of his thoughts on this as well, on why do transformations fail. So do you mind going to the next one here, Ravi? This is the point I was starting to make earlier. Everyone right now is catching this bug that everything's a transformation, right? And what I'm seeing as I'm talking with different companies is, and I saw it in the companies I worked too. Now, in some cases, we did a better job of tying these together, but you've got different leaders in different parts of organizations that are driving different transformations that are largely doing the same things. And so, DevOps has gotten really popular over the years, agile, product, cloud, digital. I mean, pick your buzzword. Everyone's pursuing some kind of a transformation, and most of your companies probably have at least 3 of these going on at any given time. And I think the challenge is, how do you actually, focus on building bottoms up change in an organization, focus on the outcomes, and think about these things holistically, because really these things all need to work in concert together to effectively change how you're actually doing technology inside of an enterprise. And to me, that's why a lot of this stuff is failing right now. John, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, it's funny when maybe a year or two ago we started hearing this sort of digital transformation, and for us who have been there since a long time, we sort of chuckled like, didn't we try that like 15, 20 years ago? And but the thing I always try to quickly get over, like the value of a name, like I don't want to just sort of say a name is useless without like giving it its college try, right? And so one of the things I started thinking about, like, maybe this is the right way to term it for a couple of reasons. One is, to your point, and I love this slide, which is that we tend to silo ourselves, right? Like, the word something that breaks my soul is when I go into a company and a lot of people who listen to this are going to sort of get upset, but hopefully that you sort of rethink something. Not that I'm always right, but just rethink it. Which is where they have like the VP of cloud infrastructure or the cloud team. And I'm like, it's just compute, network, and storage, people. Like in 5 years from now, you're going to joke about, like, you remember the magazine Computer World? I mean, it's like, don't build a whole siloed organization for cloud. Like, it's just compute, network, and storage, and for a while there we had, I think it's gotten better, but in the DevOps, the Agile people were extremely hostile to us. They had to be convinced beyond the reasonable doubt that DevOps really was a good soldier partner with Agile.
Well,
now nowadays, I find less resistance of the Agile people, and people in Agile have become like DevOps, and it's one thing, and it's actually sort of kind of cool. But for the longest time, there was this tribal nature. So that the problem, to your point, is that, like, your transformations will fail miserably if it isn't just one transformation that is based on the business. Every time you sort of technologize a transformation, because DevOps transformation is a technologized, like, love my DevOps brethren and sisterhood, but like, it is, just like cloud is, just like Agile is, just like, I mean, we even talked about Mark Schwartz's book, who's Seated at the Table. I mean, again, this is going to piss a lot of people off. He says, and again, I'm paraphrasing really badly, so Mark, I apologize, but is that, that if you have to create a chief data officer, you failed your CIO, and your sort of business information technology, whatever you're calling it, has failed. The fact that you have to make an excuse. I mean, data is not part of the CIO's responsibility. Like when did data like become, oh well, let's should we have a chief compute you know, chief network. I mean, so again, yeah, I think that, like people have to get there. And again, you see these companies that have this sort of true north where they understand that this is like at the business level. We say that all the time as platitude-ish, but they really are at the business level, and anything else siloed is nonsense. Yeah, I mean, so there's tremendous overlap. You walk into organizations and they got 6 transformation teams. You put them all in the same room and you try to convince them that they're all doing the same thing, and they argue with you for an hour that they're not. Right? Like it's like transformation is
I've lived that.
the middle circle is transformation. Right? Everything
Yeah.
else is subservient to that.
Yeah, I've lived that. So let's talk about the fact finding. Let's talk about how the stuff you've been doing ties into this.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Ravi. Yeah, so one of the things that happened is, about a little over 2.5 years ago, I left Docker. I was probably in a good 12-year run of working for vendors. Now, I've always been true to sort of the meta of our movement, right? I'll get my fingernails dirty in certain technologies like Chef or, Clanton cloud management and Docker. But I've always sort of, when I present, anybody who's seen me, I don't carry the Docker bag with me. In fact, one of my biggest constraints where they kept wanting me to do Docker pitches, and I'm like, I don't do that, right? But I left there and I thought, oh my goodness, now for the first time in like 12 years, this is 2.5 years ago, I actually can go out and be non-vendor, not have this vendor halo on me. And I was like all the things we learned from Courtney, Courtney Kissler, that was, now at Nike, at Nordstrom, amazing person. Like, can't tell you how many people have learned from her tutoring in our industry. And and Ross and all the like toolbox. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna crush it. I've learned from all the people I meet at Portland. I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna do this amazing consulting business. And what I found was a lot of that stuff was just too early. There was this sort of social technical um, sea of knowledge that I had to learn. And I'd like to say I was brilliant and I carved this out perfectly. I just kept reversing myself into a non-prescriptive method of just having conversations with people. And what I found there was sort of these immutable patterns. Now, 7, it's a cool name, 7 deadly diseases, because that sounds really cool to get selected for presentations. But there were patterns that I could categorize by just having, spend a month at a company and have a meeting with, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 or 400 people, sometimes 200-300 people, and then just sort of document what they think work does, what is the toil, trying to dissect what the incentives really are, trying to look for the Brents, if you know the Phoenix Project, like where are the bottlenecks? Do they have tribal knowledge versus institutional? Look for not just your sort of the Conway's Law, but not Conway's Law just in sort of moving from waterfall to microservices. It's Conway's Law in organizational design, like how the organizational structure, how people report to people, decisions that are made based on who they report to. And then what was beautiful about this pattern is it just magically sort of flowed into the 7th deadly disease, which is what I call security appliance theater. Like literally, by the end of the engagement, I basically mapped out that what you do for audits is false. It's fake. In fact, you were talking about, I'm not presenting the paper we did in Portland early this year, but it's called automated governance. And it's an alternative to this like nonsense that most organizations do in their audits, where it's a subjective conversation of, Sue makes a change record, Bob says, hey, put a little more subjective knowledge into how this is going to affect this incredibly complex system. And then, Tim then approves it to get into production, all based on this sort of subjective notion of how this change is going to fit some incredibly complex system, as opposed to objective, where you're actually sort of building sort of blockchain and sort of SHAs that are automatically happening in the pipeline. But anyway, it's just this kind of uncovering of this stuff that just doesn't get discussed. Even lean value stream mapping, which is an incredible tool, right? But like that's sort of artificial. Like you're pulling people from different teams and putting them together. I want the team the way it looks when I walk in the door. I want development. Give me development team 1 all day Monday. Give me development team 2 all day Tuesday. I want their water cooler. I want to earn their trust, and I want to get to like I'm one of the gang, and then it's a bitching and moaning session, right? And then start sort of colliding groups together, like put infrastructure, hear what they have to say after I talk to developers for 3 days, and then like, yeah, that's not what I heard from the developers, you know. And anyway, it's been incredibly exciting, and I think one last thing I will say is I've had this theory all along that a lot of companies that are trying DevOps in earnest, doing it all the right way, doing all the right things, still seem to hit the scale problem in the enterprise. You know, like you don't find a whole lot of companies, even the best, that get this escape velocity, you know, beyond maybe 20, 30%. And 30% is very generous. Like, I mean, most companies, even doing it right, are hovering still around 10 or 15% of their enterprise. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons I believe is you're not having honest conversations with people who you're just saying, do DevOps, don't talk back, you know. But no, don't talk back. But I've got this system that has no source control. No, I don't want to hear that. Put it in source control. You know, I mean, so I think part of it is you don't scale because you don't go in and sort of listen. You know, the first 8, 9, 10% are easy, right? It's
Yeah,
that next 75% that like where you literally have to sit down and have honest conversations like, oh, well, we have a back-end mainframe database, and like, you know, it's not going to be easy to quote unquote DevOps this. Anyway, that's what I've been doing, and it's been a blast.
that's awesome. You know, it's interesting. I've, you know, having led these transformations in a couple massive companies, I've seen all these diseases at play, and I think the reality, I completely agree with everything you're talking about. I think the interesting thing is there's a system in place organizationally that is kind of self-reinforcing, that tries to keep, you know, things from changing too much. And a lot of it is the fact that you've got, you know, people that own certain things. That's their, you know, that's their livelihood. It's the organizational structure that's been put in place. It's their baby, their audit processes, or their compliance processes, or their operations processes that they've basically staked their career on. And unwinding that stuff is really hard. And it's relatively easy to take some, you know, small teams, a small part of the organization, and kind of break them off to the side and separate them from, you know, the whole organizational antibodies thing, like, you know, protect them from the existing organization that might fight against the change that they're doing. And I think most companies can get to that point where they pick, you know, maybe some digital part of their organization, or some part that they really can get everyone behind, they need to change, and they can break it apart, separate it, and they make some changes. The problem is that's not enterprise scale. And when you actually go to try to drive the change into the broader enterprise, you're fighting against all these things that you lay out here. And one thing that I thought was kind of cool in what you said is, you know, for me, you do find out what's really going on in the enterprise when you roll up your sleeves and you talk to the engineers, and you literally hear what are the pains and the challenges that you all have, either, you know, working with each other across the organization, or interacting with management, or, you know, how priorities are set, et cetera. You know, I've been fortunate in the roles I've been. I've had a pretty strong connection across the engineering community, so I have had line of sight to a lot of these things, which has helped me navigate them at more senior levels. And you know, as we said at the beginning, John, you're an engineer's engineer, so I can totally see how you've been able to come in from the outside and immediately build some of that trust with that community, because that's what it takes to really kind of uncover, you know, the facade of what you hear about how things are going, from the normal, you know, reporting and communication chains, to really finding out what's really going on under the covers.
and my heart is like, this job is very hard because I always joke that the first hour, I come in, sometimes I'll just draw a box on everybody's like, who is he? Oh, he's a DevOps expert. He wrote the handbook. Oh, and everybody has their sort of opinion. A lot of people have their arms crossed, like they're mad that they have to be in this meeting this is the 10th time some expert has come in to make their life better, and and they're very hostile to me. And I draw a box on the whiteboard and I say, hey, how does it work? So I'm really good. I mean, I calculated one time, I've trained probably 15,000 professionals in my career. There was a 10-year run where I did Tivoli training, and I probably trained 10,000 people in a 10-year run. But anyway, so I'm really good at sort of like working the crowd, right? But so I'll draw a box and I'll say, hey, and I try to play the Columbo character, so how does work start? And they argue with me for about an hour about how that's a stupid question, how I don't understand capital markets, and blah, 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 blah. And I just hold in, and finally, like, well, if you must know, and then you're sort of part of that team. So it's about that, like, really breaking through the barriers, because most people want to tell you it's fine. They're like, hey, how does this work? Like, I can't go in and ask people, this is my favorite, right? I can't go in at people and ask, like, how accurate is your CMDB? Oh, it's fine. Let's move on. But if I break through with you, and then part of it is that, have you ever worked with a product called TIBCO? Yeah, I have, but dude, they're not going to stop me on technology. I started writing mainframe assembler in 1980 for Exxon, like, and I've been through literally every phase since then on bleeding edge technology. Like, so, like, I'm not an expert in any of these things, but you ain't going to stump me. So I earned their trust on tech. Like, I think that's why you earn their trust, Ross, because, you seem like this leadership, perfect leader and all of that. But then you sit down with you on the nuts and bolts, and you have, like, as much experience as anybody I know on the nuts and bolts, right? So you have to win all that. And, then you get people to that sort of water cooler, phase where they really want to start telling you the things that they're hoping there's a chance that you might actually get the message up. But it is about, like, earning trust on the technology level. It's earning trust on the sort of, this is the personal level. I always tell people, like, John, is this going to change anything? I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and report all this up accurately. And if they don't like what I have to say, they're still going to pay me anyway.
So, Ross, John, this is a fascinating conversation. Let me try to move this forward because I want to like the proven models and stuff. So, Ross, I'll bring it back to you again. John raised a lot of good points in terms of what he sees in the organizations, and you have expertise with two large Fortune 50 companies. Can you pull it all together for us and kind of talk through the models that have been successful for you as you take enterprises through these transformations?
Yeah, I think, if you think back to that earlier slide we had where we said everything was a transformation, I think John hit an important point on that is, at the end of the day, this has to be a business-driven transformation. It's not if it's technology driven, you're not going to be successful at scale. And what I've seen, and I've had the opportunity to kind of work out a playbook and try different things, and have a lot of experiments and failures and successes on the journey at some of the companies I've been at. And I'll just simplify it into kind of, at the end of the day, there's kind of 4 different areas that I think are critical to move in parallel and really put energy behind to drive these transformations. The first is all about the operating model, and John talked about on the 7 deadly diseases too, and it's how do you get an operating model and a structure for work and for the organization that's optimized for teams being able to work more autonomously and really owning their own, they build it, they run it. And over the last few years, I think, the product-based operating model has really emerged as the best way to do that. Product companies have been able to operate that way, but it's been large enterprises now that are figuring out how to implement that model at scale across hundreds of teams. And I think that's really powerful. I think there's some guidance that's starting to emerge on product operating models in the industry. Mick has his book, Project to Product. The paper that I referred to at the beginning, we really dive deep into how to do that type of a transformation. And My talk at the summit will definitely dive deeper on that. Beyond that, culture, I think, is actually the hardest part, and it takes deliberate focus in companies. It can't be something that you just kind of leave as an afterthought. I've generally had an investment and a whole program focused on helping pivot a culture to be more connected, collaborative, grow an engineering culture, get your engineers across the organization sharing with each other and not, relying on communication up and down through the management chains for them to actually find out what each other are doing. And, that takes things like running internal DevOps Day conferences, and, dojos can be an enabler here. We'll talk about dojos in a minute. Hackathons, just different things you can do to really grow that community inside your company, and even your engagement in the external community. Practices are the other major component that require a lot of focus. The reality is most enterprises have built a lot of competency around outsourcing engineering, program management, project management, requirements analysis. Those are all kind of stable thing, or staples, I guess, that existed in the waterfall model, and they're things that are fundamentally changing as people are modernizing, and so now it's bringing in things like product and lean and agile and just a whole slew of continually evolving engineering practices that organizations need to learn. And so the dojos, which I am going to dive into over the coming slides, is actually a major way that we've scaled, that I've seen scaling practices work effectively in large enterprises. And then finally, your technology agenda. There's a lot of technology change in the industry, and how can you be deliberate about introducing technology change in a way that's enabling your teams to pivot and work more autonomously. And I think there's a lot of different platforms, whether it's Kubernetes and people starting to build cloud native with Docker. A lot of that stuff has to get introduced into the organization at scale, and you've got to figure out how to help teams experiment and learn on those things, but also figure out how to apply it at scale across the organization. So there's a whole bunch of depth behind these 4 pillars, and I think we'll probably have some future webinars that go deeper on some of them, but at a super high level, that's generally where I've focused. And it's a matter of focusing across these things to really drive change inside organizations.
That's right,
John,
Ross.
what's your thought?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll go quickly because you've covered just about everything that I would say. But I think you're right. Well, not you think you're right. We know, like the industry's told us, it's project mentalities is like dead. You are in the dark ages. You'll probably die if you're still sort of focusing on sort of budget and project managers and classic Gantt charts. I think anything you hear from the DevOps perspective about behavior patterns that bubble up to your culture, you have to empower and create collaborative. The one thing I want to say about lean is I think we sort of under deploy the real power of lean in DevOps. One of the things that Gene and I have explored, you said Beyond the Phoenix Project. Actually, that's out. That's been out for a year, but it's an audio-only book. Shameless plug. But like we really dissect like the sort of things that we feel really are the sort of the legs of a 3-stool, thing called DevOps, right? And we really explore like Mike Rother's Toyota Kata, and like how like there's this notion of a true north, and there's a notion of like how you embrace complexity to get there. And so most people think lean is just some sort of poster on the wall and the 12 ways or the 20 ways to do lean. If you really want to dive in, sort of read Mike Rother's or Steven Spear, and he speaks at DevOps Center. In fact, he's speaking again in Vegas. Like you listen to these 2 authors, Steven Spear and Mike Rother, and you get to see a lean in a way that is just so productive. And it's why Toyota was incredibly productive. And the one last thing about technology excellence, I'm a big fan of sort of immersive learning, but it's also decoupling yourself. I tell a lot of my clients, actually don't think about Kubernetes and Docker. Think about cluster-based computing and atomic computing. And like that's a whole webinar into itself. But like it's the Simon Sinek start, like don't anchor yourself to like Chef or Kubernetes, or like anchor yourself to sort of a model of the technology you want it to look. and the world will be just all clusters. Kubernetes is the facade today of what that looks like, and it may be there for 10 years, but the truth of the matter is we will run in the next 5 years, almost everything everything that's moving forward will be running as sort of cluster-based compute with very small sort of compute instances, maybe containers, maybe functions.
Yep. Completely agree. Let's should we pivot to dojos, Ravi?
Yep.
We got the dojo man on the call, man.
Yeah.
Do it.
So I want to share maybe a little bit of, I'm going to tell a story on how these form, because dojos have become pretty popular in the industry. And what happened is, so when we were moving from a stage at Target where we were experimenting and kind of proving what was possible, there was a point in time when I was driving DevOps transformation there where I still had to prove that, hey, you could manage your infrastructure as code, you could automate everything end to end, you could really truly apply CI/CD to what you're delivering. And we incubated that with some small teams where we had some really rock star engineers go and solve these problems and kind of show back to the organization what was possible. And we actually did it on a fairly, like a monolithic package-based application. It wasn't this, the mobile digital use cases you generally hear people tackle. We wanted to tackle on a hard problem so that we could go back to all the leaders across the organization and say, hey, code wins arguments, right? So we wanted to make sure we were prepared to have those discussions. And the conversation fundamentally changed. It changed from, is this possible, to how do we do this at scale? And so the challenge was kind of put on me and my team to figure out, how do we scale these ways of working across hundreds and hundreds of teams? And we put our heads together. I tapped into this community. I was visiting Courtney Kistler at Nordstrom and seen some of the tactics they were doing, and visiting other leaders, and kind of took a bunch of things we learned from a bunch of people and started running experiments on how do we do immersive learning. The idea being, our belief, and this has been my belief all along, is that the best way to learn is by doing, and the best way to then, and the level of learning that people need to go through, there's no way that we're just going to put people through tons and tons of training classes. They have to learn on the job. And we wanted to create an environment that enabled that. And we wanted to layer in assistance to guide people on some of the newer ways of thinking, so that they were learning, immersive learning, while they were building the products and services that they are already planning to build for the organization. And 30 or so experiments later, the dojos emerged as the mechanism for doing this. And so what a dojo is, the concept is, it's the place you go to master your craft. There's a tie-in obviously with martial arts. It's the most common use of the term, but it's used in other parts of, it's used in other scenarios as well. And what it looks like is you have teams come in for extended periods of time to build the products and services that they're already planning to build. And the coaches, you have a team of coaches and experts, and maybe platform experts and technology experts that work alongside them. And you have a somewhat structured, accelerated model for them to get assistance, kind of pairing and co-creating to build their products and build their skills. And I've seen the dojos now, 5-6 years later, there's a number of Fortune 500 companies doing them. I'm aware of at least 50. And I'm sure there's a lot more than that I just don't have line of sight to. People are tweaking and pivoting the model, but I think if they hold true to, it's an immersion model and it's learning by doing, I think that's really at the core of what the dojo is all about. And it really had become the engine to drive across those 4 pillars at Target. So let me just share a little bit on the process for the dojo, at least the model, the flavor of dojo that we created for Target, and what's the primary model I would say that's happening in the industry. I'm going to hit this real quick because this is probably we've kept this a more high level discussion up to this point, but the idea is teams come in, they charter, they figure out what they're going to do, and each individual team will enter these dojo environments for extended periods of time. I've usually done 6 week engagements, and we have a process while they're in there for that 6 weeks that we call hyper sprints, and we actually have the teams break their work down into 2-day sprints so that they're essentially doing 12 iterations of building and delivering product in the time that they're there. And it gives us a lot of iterations to really zero in on some of their engineering practices and make sure that they're building good discipline practices into both their product planning and their delivery. And once they're done, they kind of go back into the wild, and we've helped bootstrap those teams so that they're better able to be productive in these newer ways of working moving forward. And the key is, there's a few ways you scale this. You scale it by having dojo capacity to be able to handle a number of teams. Both companies I did this at, we could handle 15 to 20 teams at parallel. But you also scale it by building that culture and community that I was talking about. So you think about the other parts of the transformation program, and you have these people that have gone through go and be evangelists back in their portfolios and their organizations, so that they're spreading these ways of working, and they're also helping pull people into the dojos. And I've seen a lot of benefits. I've seen hundreds of teams literally go through these types of experiences now across many companies. And what you see is just a rapid learning environment. You're helping people start to almost learn how to learn, especially when they've been in cultures that just pushes training culture down their throat so much. You see people being able to shift to these more full stack ways of working, and you see more productivity. You see their time to value and their cycle time and lead time really significantly improve because they're learning how to own their end-to-end delivery and not just their step in some siloed process. So it's been really powerful. I think Liatrio's got some really good guidance on how to do dojos that I think if folks are interested in this, you can definitely talk with me or talk with Liatrio. We can dive a little bit deeper on it. So I don't know, I want to talk about dojos as a transformation engine a little bit, but I'd love, John, for you, before I jump into how I've seen that work, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I know this is a topic you've definitely had some experience in over the years as well. You there, John?
My bad, I was on mute. I always think about you when I think about companies that are doing dojos, that sort of back to something I said earlier, copy and die versus adapt or die. If you're sort of copying what you think a dojo should be, but your organization, I mean, I won't name who they are, but I've seen a couple companies that have had terrible IT, terrible hygiene, just, really not done anything to change their way. And one of the sort of leaders in there thinks like they're going to boost their resume by creating a dojo. And they'll tell you flat out that that's why they're doing it. They'll whisper to you my management is going to give me a budget. I'm going to whole floor. And like you think about, okay, what are you doing? You're accelerating bad habits. And I always think about you, Ross, and I'll try to go real quick. I know you want to finish up here, but I used to go back to how this thing was started. Your first experiment at Target, you didn't even know what it was going to be. I remember you telling me it was an office. It was a small office. I was privileged to be sort of the second famous person, if you will, to go to the 15,000 square feet in what is it, Brooklyn
Park, Minnesota.
And by the way, don't take an Uber from the airport there. But and I saw this, and I knew, you started out in an office, a 12 by 12, and now you're in 15,000 square foot in this incredible floor, and your headquarters campus, and you emerged into that. And then you went to Verizon, and it was different. We had a conversation about you had to do it different because they had already sort of started DevOps there. You got in after a 5-year journey of Verizon doing DevOps, and really what you were trying to do is course correct, in my words. And so I always sort of think of you a lot when I sort of evaluate a dojo, and if I'm asked to create an opinion on it, where were you at, and what was your sort of goal to start this thing? If it was just if it's somebody just wants to get it on their resume, be really careful, and it goes back to my 7 deadly thieves. I mean, you literally have to know what your basically underlying sort of social technical hygiene is before you start creating immersive,
Yeah.
accelerating learning patterns. Anyway, I'm
Yeah.
done.
No, you're right. And I've got a thought on that, and then I'm going to explain how I've used these strategically. But it was interesting. The State of DevOps report this year, I saw dojos get kind of buried in with a training center kind of organizing topic for a section of transformation in that report, if anyone reads the report. And it really bothered me because everything that we started dojos to be and everything that I've been kind of preaching and evangelizing and helping other companies in the industry is anything but that. It's an immersion center where you're learning by doing, not somewhere that you go to just take training classes. And everything about what I feel like made it successful, I feel like was the opposite of the message that got conveyed in the State of DevOps report. And as I talked with some of the folks, that are tied into that report and the analysis that goes into the report, they brought up a really good point. They said, that's true in your experiences with it, but we've talked to other people, just like to your point, John, where they use dojo as a buzzword. They truly do just stand it up as a training center. They stand it up maybe to build their own resume, and it doesn't work when you do that. And it actually can contribute to the problem versus helping solve the problem of helping, organizations pivot and modernize. And so one thing I thought about with that is I've got to do more and the community that is formed around dojos needs to do more to position how to think about these things strategically and how to actually drive these things in organizations so that you are getting the value that you need to get out of it. And it's really helping move your transformation forward. And I think for me, one thing that was interesting is when we look across those 4 pillars I talked about, which is generally how I've approached transformation everywhere I've been, I've actually used dojos as kind of this transformation engine to drive change across those pillars from an operating model perspective of moving, from projects to products. It's powerful when you can bootstrap teams in that new way of working. A product model means you move from a siloed waterfall, hand things over to the next person in the value stream, and eventually you get it delivered to I own that end to end. The team structures change, the responsibilities in the teams change. And that can be really powerful when you're moving teams into that new way of working to just bootstrap them in an environment like a dojo. And that's exactly how we scaled the operating model change at Target. From day one, I've always positioned dojos as a way to scale practices. I think that's pretty kind of clear and obvious to folks that, you can really dive deep with people on the product, lean, DevOps, agile, et cetera, practices when you've got people in that type of an environment. But beyond that, the other pillars.
Go ahead. Finish up, Ross.
Yeah, let me hit these other 2 and I'll get your reaction to it. The culture, I've seen so in both companies that I introduced dojos, I had someone approach me at some point in the journey and say pretty much the exact same sentence to me. And it was, I feel like I'm working at a different company. And when you think about that, and you look at what we're doing, we're in a state of driving change across the organization. We purposefully created a very different cultural experience, which is ultimately what we were striving to get to the whole company to in these dojo environments. So when people were coming in, it was a fast-paced, highly collaborative, everyone's connecting with each other horizontally type of an environment where you're sharing with each other and you're learning a ton. And that is powerful. And when you actually can figure out how to leverage them as this kind of cultural hub to bring more people in and out of that experience, bring leaders in and out of that experience. At Target and at Verizon, we started bringing other companies in and out so that they could see what we were doing so we could help influence this in the industry. It can be a powerful enabler for starting to show what could change culturally and start to guide the organization on culture change. And then finally, with technology, when you start introducing some of these new platforms and, whether it's introducing Kubernetes into the environment or you're starting to drive, serverless and functions as a service more, that it's a great place, again, to incubate teams. Teams are starting to experiment. You've got platform teams in some cases forming around stuff to help build, a common way for enterprises to tackle this. And it's powerful. You can pull those early adopter teams together in the dojos with the coaches. The coaches are figuring out how to apply the practices to these new technologies, and the people that are bringing those technologies to bear and the early adopter teams can start working together to start to come up with some patterns to help guide the organization. And I've seen all four of those play out very effectively. And I think if you're deliberate about positioning the dojos across those things and you're thinking about it that way, and it's not just a training center where you go to learn something, it can be really, really powerful. And I've seen them be that engine that kind of helps drive that change.
Russ, we're going to go over, but I got to ask you because I know I'm pretty certain what your answer is going to be. I think people sort of look at dojo and they hear what they want to hear. Dojos aren't cheap, right? When I went and visited you in at Verizon, so I was fortunate to visit the dojo that Ross had built in both Target and Verizon, right? And when Ross is talking about I don't want to give up anything you don't want to give, but when I tell people you want to really build a dojo, right? It's you need coaches, you need a dojo manager, you need an evangelist, you need somebody. It needs to be treated like a separate product. And you start adding up the numbers, and where I started sort of running in my head that you were doing at Verizon, I'm like you can't fake this. You can't say, well, I'll start. I mean, I guess you can, but you can. It goes to the core of a lot of DevOps transformation, and I'll get sort of mouthy here, but is that if you want to run two pizza teams or build run teams, you can't fake it. You can't run sprints with pods that I'll take these 5 people, put them together for 6 sprints, and then we'll throw them back in the pool. And that's not what the purpose of build around or two pizza teams are all about. You got to have you really have to invest in the amount of people that it would take to run service teams. It's the same with dojo. You can say, well, we'll build this thing. We'll take, that library area, and we'll throw 2 people over there, and we'll build it. I guess you can do that, but that's not what you're going to get when, when I went to Verizon, you hadn't even been there that long, and you had already built out, literally, there were each dojo had 7 or 8 coaches, an agile coach, a cloud coach, all the technology coaches. And then you had a project, somebody who ran the scheduling and all that, which is a ton of work, and I don't know. I mean, you can't fake this.
It's an investment, and it to make the case to invest that kind of money, you have to be able to position it as part of a broader transformation strategy. It's not just some new way of coaching that you're just going to suddenly in your organization. You're not going to get anything different than what you had before.
John, Ross, fascinating conversation, and I know we're over time, and I'd like to get to any questions that are there. If that's okay with both of you, I'm going to skip over just trying to get into a little more of our spiel around our methodology, but directly try to get to questions. Is that okay with both of you?
Yep.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
So let's open it up for questions, and then I can come back and close it with our framework and where Liatrio is going to be. Mitch, let me bring you into this. Any questions that I'd like to ask John and Ross?
Absolutely. Love to get into some of our audience questions here. First question is for you, John. What do you think is the root cause of banks putting their heads in the sand? This is from our audience. Do you think it's the complexity of their environments? What is it that is sort of easy just to keep going and not take on this challenge?
They think it's the complexity of their environment, right? All environments are complex, right? Let's just get that out of the way. It is their notion of what you have to do from a policy perspective and regulation perspective, that the sort of the separation, the haves and have-nots. The have-nots basically are sort of not questioning the 1990s playbook on how to do, governance, risk, and compliance. And literally, so they're abiding by rules that were built in a time when physical servers were in racks, and you had to sort of have all these sort of attestations around. I mean, the one I love, that I still get a kick out of, one of my recent clients, was every time they have to do something on Amazon, they have to create the business continuity case for S3. S3 is I don't know, data at rest is 30 it's a 30 sigma. No, I meant probably a 10 sigma, but it's 39s. That means every molecule in the universe except for one would have to be destroyed. you know, for the data get lost. But like every time, they're like, I have to go and I have to write this business continuity, you know. So yeah, I mean, sort of winding down, the answer is it is what they think their sort of service management, their ITIL, their sort of policy and governance playbook. You know, sometimes you go to banks, these books are like, you can stack them like, 10 feet high. And you ask them, where is that regulation? They're like, even online, they can't find it, so that's their problem, is that the ones that sort of can't, I call it proportional shredding of your service or your sort of risk policy. You have to figure out the things that actually, there's the things that are just ridiculous. There are the things that are sort of ridiculous, but like just throw them a bone, let them have that one. And then there's the ones that, that really do make you safer.
Mm-hmm. Let me kind of expand this a little bit, add you into the conversation, Ross, on this. Someone else also asked, what is sort of that resistance to igniting transformation in the enterprise? Is it just adopting new ways of doing things, or is it fear of risk, which I'm sure some of both probably?
Yeah, just even building off of John's response there. It's funny. I was speaking with someone in a healthcare company, I don't know, about a month ago, and I had just spoke about driving large scale transformation, and what some of the barriers were to change. I was really diving into some of the leadership constraints that I've dealt with in different organizations. And I was doing like an open space discussion with someone in there, and this was a much smaller organization than the two I've driven change in. And they're like, well, yeah, you probably don't, retail Target, probably not nearly as complex as our company, or you're not dealing with the scale that we're dealing with. And I'm thinking, all right, I've done this in two enterprises, both have 300,000 people. I mean, Target has tables that have 1 billion rows in them because of how many, scale of customers are interacting with the systems on a daily basis. And the regulations that you see in every industry, telecom has some insane regulations that I would say rival the finance regulations. And even at Target, we own banks, so we dealt with all the banking regulations as well. But people don't realize that, and they just will quickly just like earlier in the DevOps movement, people would draw conclusions to say, well, it's only the unicorns, it's only the Facebooks and Netflix and Amazons that can do that. Any traditional enterprise can't. Now, as some traditional enterprises are doing it, people will always find reasons why theirs is special and unique and has to have all the legacy constraints that have always been in place. And I think that's probably a little bit of human nature. It's just people tend to think like they're unique and they've got challenges. And I think I've seen this in the organizations I've worked, you kind of get, I call it learned helplessness. You get so preconditioned to think a certain way because you've been constrained in that way for so long. I remember the first time we empowered teams at Target to deliver their own infrastructure as code and not be dependent on some separate centralized team. Like the same scenario played out with every team. They're like, well, we can't do this yet. We have to wait on our infrastructure. And my coaches would be like, no, you don't. You can do this yourself, and here's how. And it was like, you deal with disbelief for a bit, and then like you see this weight lifted off people's shoulders when they finally have the epiphany, like, oh, we are actually more empowered when we start to change. But this learned helplessness grows in the organizations. I think it exists at every level, and I think that contributes a lot to why there's resistance and why people feel the way that they do. But I think, if you come listen to my talk at the summit or watch the video after, and I think you'll hear a lot of insight into how do you actually approach introducing change in organizations and then scaling it and optimizing it over time. And I think it'll start to share how do you start to tackle some of those constraints in the organization.
I'm sorry, I got to steal one more minute. Ross, you should write a book, because one of the things I've forgotten most of them, but I would tell your dojo stories. And it's like not how you build a dojo, why you build a dojo. It'd be some of the stories that you would tell me of how people would come in. You told me about a team prototyping a mainframe app where they didn't they weren't even going to code. And you told me another team about like a team that like one of the business analysts figures something out on the third, micro sprint, and I think it's those stories that I like that you would tell me when I visit. I mean, I think that those are the most amazing part of why dojos are so incredible, is that like when you hear these sort of anecdotal stories, not just like we immersed, we did this, we did that, it's the sort of like nugget stories that I've heard from you over the years, when we're sort of drinking beers and you tell me the story, it's like, wow, that's why a freaking dojo is important.
Excellent. Appreciate both your perspectives on that. I feel like we could go another 2 hours just on that one topic. Here's another one that's really meaty. There's a lot of questions around how you adopt moving from project to product sort of approach and how an organization makes that transformation. I'm just kind of bundle those into one topic. What's your best guidance to individuals and to organizations to how to start to make that transformation?
Ooh, that's a big question. First of all, read the research, the IT Revolution paper that we just published on this. It's literally like 100 pages. That's why I'm saying this is a big question. I think honestly, the best way to start is to just start. Like figure out for your own individual team or at a very small scale, how can you start to pivot some of the ways that you're structuring your work and your teams, and focus on kind of incubating change and experimenting and getting a model figured out that works for you, but try to do it in a way where you're not disrupting the broader kind of enterprise mechanism yet, until you can actually start to prove what's possible and start to bring on some leaders to get behind that and support that change in the organization. Again, this is core to what I'm going to be talking about at the summit. So I'll have a lot more guidance that'll kind of go into how do you go from incubating to scaling it and stuff. But that's probably in the little bit of time we have, that's probably the simplest advice I could give.
I would totally recommend going to see or watching Ross's presentation, and then with that or before, read the because it's really, really good. It's very meaty. I will say one thing that it's my pet peeve now these days is if you can't change budgeting, there's a couple of things that you just can't fake it. And what I'm finding at these banks right now is this budgeting decisions are sort of run the bank, build the bank. I mean, they're like you talk DevOps all day long, but at the CEO level, the budgets are allocated for run the bank, ops, and and build the bank or change the bank, dev. Like you're sort of doomed from the start, right? And so you have to sort of break this like waterfall budgeting, and you get an allocation for that year. And most organizations are trying to run DevOps. The people who were somehow bucketed under run the bank, hey, you're 1.5 billion last year, and you get it down to 1. Great job, you got it down from 1.7. Is there any way you get it down to 1.2? So this mentality that's being forced systemically from the top in some notion that it is run the bank, and it's not just banks, that is already their hands are already forced to bifurcate what is dev and ops.
Yeah.
And if you're unlucky and you fall into that sort of run the bank, like your whole structure is to save more money. And you know how people try to save money, like systemically, like what you call it, like sort of learned
helplessness.
Learning helplessness is that you think, I mean, still at the senior levels, they think cut head count and buy more product. And so you wind up going and, buying Larry Ellison's new autonomous compute that you never have to configure. Like no human has ever has to configure anything anymore. What glorious days. I mean, come on, folks. The point is that like if you really want to get to the core, you have to look at your top-down budgeting.
Yeah.
And you can't break the yearly budget cycle. I mean, you can do really great things, but like you're always going to be struggling.
Yeah, and I just want to add one point on top of that. I think John's absolutely right. I think the last mile on truly doing these transformations is changing the funding model, and it's probably one of the hardest things to do. You're not going to be able to do it at the beginning because you're still trying to prove what's possible. And so I think, you know, some tactics we've seen work when you're starting is maybe you've got a leader that's able to somewhat abstract how they're funding their team a little bit from the kind of bigger macro funding model, and they are able to carve out a little piece on the side to prove it out. But eventually you got to tackle that. And if you're going to do this at any kind of scale in an organization, that has to change. And I think it's hard. There's some good guidance and some companies have done it, but it's not easy work. And I would say even, you know, ops obviously in the old world is tied to the run the business model, but even on the, you know, the grow, you know, build and grow the business, it's still in the old funding models is project and program based investments. You're not structuring that work based on products that you're trying to have that have an ongoing life for the organization. And so even in that side of the equation, you're still running into challenges where funding is kind of working against the operating model that you're trying to move to.
Great. Well, wish we had another 2 hours to spend with both of you. Ravi, let's jump to you. I'd love to hear some more about the Ignite Lab.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. So, you know, we've had a fascinating conversation today, and last week we John and Casey Lee, our director of engineering, had a webinar around Ignite Lab. So just to kind of give you an overview, so Ignite Lab is our way of having an immersive, hands-on Kickstarter for large enterprises to get going on their journey around containers, cloud native, and all the modern engineering practices. We've kind of built a lab that allows executives and also hands-on the keyboard engineers to come together to kind of do it in a setting where experts from our team can kind of guide you on all these concepts. But I think the bigger one is how they'll all have a common understanding so that they can plan for their journey to these modern ways of working together. So we've had a lot of success running it in various parts of the country. We have more coming up. We are at KubeCon, so on day one, the day before the conference, we have an Ignite Lab running. Registrations are open on our website. We're planning for one in the Bay Area. We've seen a lot of interest from our clients in the Bay Area to come back and do this. And then next year, we also have a large presence at DelReConf. We're planning to do an Ignite Lab there. So for anyone still on the webinar who are interested, please come and check this out. Please also listen to the webinar last week by Casey Lee and John Willis. You'll get a lot of information there. And then lastly, I want to end on this note. You know, we've talked a lot today about DevOps Enterprise Summit. We've spoken about John's way of working of going into the enterprises and having fact finding. We've spoken about what Ross does or has pioneered in the industry around dojos and tying all the operating model, culture, practices, and technology excellence together. Liatrio has its own framework. We call it the Ignite framework. We have not had a chance to get into it today. We'll probably come back in the follow-up webinars to kind of talk through it, kind of get into the details of how we lead an enterprise through that transformation journey. But before all of that, if you want to talk to us, we are at booth 915 at the DevOps Enterprise Summit. So please come by and say hello. We'll love to get into all of these topics and more.
Excellent. Well, we definitely encourage folks to come see all of us at DevOps Enterprise. Appreciate so much the conversation with all of you, Ravi, Ross, John. Just a fantastic hour and 20 minutes. Really, I know I've picked up so much stuff. Appreciate the wealth of knowledge that you have, and also look forward to seeing you at the DevOps Enterprise Summit. This is Mitch Ashley. I'd like to thank our audience for all the time that you've spent with us today. Your time is valuable, and we know that we all appreciate having you with us. So it's my pleasure to host the webinar for you today. Everyone, have a great day and be careful out there.